getting to impact. That's why we're here. And today we're talking about tracking and communicating your impact. So if that's why you're here, woohoo, you're in the right spot. We're going to take that as a win today. But we've just started our welcomes and check-ins. If you have just joined us, we are just asking you to put your name and where you're from in the chat box. And we have been having a conversation about how long it's been since we've had a haircut. So if you want to add that in too, that's just a fun piece of information for us all. Even Mark needs a haircut, he's saying. And so I feel like he's looking forward to it. The rest of us are definitely looking forward to it. So this is kind of our agenda for the day. We're going to go through our key items. We're going to kind of revisit the program, what we're all about, what we're doing. Mark's going to walk us through today's kind of what we're learning today, provide all that information. There'll be a chance for some questions, and then we'll look at what the next homework will be for between sessions 2 and 3. So today our big question that we're looking at is how might we better track and communicate our outcomes and impact in our deepening community efforts, and how do we communicate that out to our stakeholders? We know that sometimes we know the value of deepening community, but how do we make that tangible? How do we explain that? How do we build that case for folks who are not in our world? And so that's why we're so excited that Mark will be here with us. Before that, the other reason we think about evaluation, there's really 3 reasons why we would bother doing evaluation at all. One is communicating and providing that big picture of what's happening in order to engage people and build the momentum and inform and report. That's kind of where we're at. There's also the piece around strategic learning and using those measurements as a way of like learning about what we're doing and the impact that's having, and maybe changing up what we're doing based on all of that evaluation. And then there's that prove the value in making strategic choices. And so we've got 6 sessions together. So we're going to stick with, hey, let's talk about how are we communicating what we're doing and the impact that it's having. We're going to stick around base one, that first reason why. So the program, for those of you who are just joining, or this is your first session with us, we had an orientation session before. And if you haven't watched it yet, which I think everybody here probably has, but if you haven't had a chance, we did send that information out in the last email, but if you need it, reach out to me and I'll get it to you again. Today we're talking about our tracking impact. That will be us. And then we've got 6 more modules, or sorry, 4 more modules. And then we will be looking and hoping that you will be writing impact reports, and maybe, hopefully, by November 30th. That would be our ultimate goal, and we're here to support you along that way. And that's, each one of the modules will help build and help support you in that process. I do want to point out over here this nice image. There's the webinars, which Mark is here to lead. Then there's coaching, and so that's a big piece where your manager of cities or me will be there to support you and working through the workbook and the questions that they ask. All of that will be helping to support you in writing your impact report. And then all 3 is where that sweet spot is, which is what's happening here today. So we're so excited you could join us for the webinar. So who, just as a show of hands, who did your homework? Anybody? I see some like, well, kind of. Congratulations for those of you who did. For those of you who haven't yet, you have the ultimate excuse right now. All things COVID, you're good to go. We understand that, but it is important that you kind of think through those pieces, thinking about what kind of strategy do you have. Part of me wants me to ask you to like act out if you know where this is, but I won't do that. We won't do acting lessons today. To assess kind of where your efforts are at, and then also to decide if you are like where you are in those 3 options around, like, do you want to be a trail builder and like get that impact report out? Do you want to be a learning community member who attends the webinars and works through the workbook, and then maybe or maybe not produce an impact report. And then 3 is be an observer, someone who just kind of wants to be kept in the loop. So I am hoping that now that you've all introduced yourselves, that you will write your answer to number 3, step number 3, in the chat box. If you've given some thought to it. If you haven't, if you're like still undecided, you can say that. But if you have decided whether you're going to be a trail builder, a learning community member, or an observer, if you could write that in the chat box, that would be great. And I want to pass the ball over to Heather just quickly, because I know that she wants to brag about one of her members. So over to you, Heather, for a minute.
So Carla, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'm going to talk on your behalf because Carla sent in her homework and I just thought I would share. So on the introductory, we talked about the strategy continuum and where you are, whether your emergent strategies, your umbrella strategies, or your detailed strategies. And so Carla is from L'Arche Stratford, and they have plotted themselves on the continuum of the umbrella strategy. We also talked about the imperative and their imperative. So our imperative is our plan is to create a fully accessible community resource for the neighborhood around 426 Britannia in the city of Stratford, and those with intellectual disabilities and their circle of supports. So that's their imperative. And I am so excited because they're going to be a trailblazer. They're going to do a impact report. So I'm so excited. And thank you so much, Carla, for sending it in. And I just wanted to toot your horn and say thank you.
Great.
I also want to point out that everybody who's responded to this question in the chat box has said trail builder. So woohoo, that's awesome. That is excellent. So thanks everybody. That's great news. Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thanks, Glenda, and thanks, Heather, for a real good start there. It's a great title to be a trail builder, and because it means you're helping us figure out how to do these things by learning by doing, and also it allows us to be learning oriented, to not always have to be things perfect, to do things perfectly. And I always think in these things, the best we get is madly off in the right direction or clumsily off in the right direction, and we just learn our way through these. So what we want to do now is to do a little bit of learning about impact, and to do that, I'm going to make 4 points. Outcomes versus impact. What is your parrot story or your imperative? Want to distinguish between 3 types of impact. I want to, then we want to talk about 3 options for choosing indicators and methods. And I'll tell you why we're not going to give you right up front a set of metrics that you should use. It's going to be kind of obvious when we get there, but 3 options you have for developing your own. And then once again, wanting to return to this question, at least around impact contribution versus attribution. And then we'll take some questions about that and discuss the next iteration of homework. And again, what we're doing is building your imperative story chunk by chunk. It's kind of clumsy, but we're going to focus on the chunk today called impact. So if we go to the next slide, outcomes versus impact. How many people, show of hands, remember the parrot story? Okay, most of you, not everyone. I'm just going to refer to it again. The parrot is called Jaquette, and you know what? I'm so glad I found this photo. I just think that's the best looking Caribbean island scene you could ever come up with. It's real, by the way, folks. It's not pretend, but that's the Isle of St. Lucia. And this parrot is called Jaquette, and I'll go through the story quickly because some of you have heard it. In 1977, there was only 100 Jaquettes left on the entire island because people were poaching them. Kids were using them for target practice, and they were almost extinct. So if we go to the next slide, Glenda, you can pound through these bullet points here. What unfolded over a 10-year period in order to improve the number of Jaquettes on the island, the number of these parrots, is they went through a multi-level change process, which began with presenting a policy package to create preservation areas for the parrot and to punish poachers. That didn't go anywhere because the public and the government, the small island government, that wasn't a policy priority. So they actually went and started doing a social marketing campaign to improve people's identity and awareness of and identity and commitment to the parrot. And so they went through a whole bunch of exercises, if we would call them programs, if you will. They started doing parrot education in schools. They put parrot stories on the bus. They had media stories that compared their parrot to other national birds, including, again, the American bald eagle, and they made that comparison, our parrot versus the bald eagle. It's kind of like comparing Salma Hayek and Dick Cheney. We got a way better looking parrot. And all games, folks. Why? The outcome is to improve people's identity with the parrot and sense of ownership. While they're doing that, there's a rise in international ecotourism, which kind of seems mainstream today, but it sure wasn't back then. But they said, hey, let's actually turn this into an ecotourism bump as well and get people really committed to this. And they introduced a second policy package, which had the features of the first one, preserve and punish, but also a regulatory framework for ecotourism. What did that do? It created a burst of new ecotourism businesses on the ground, which then in turn over time pushed greater pressure on the policy environment again, because you can't get the policy environment context right the first time. Some of you are from Edmonton, and this is a metaphor for many other communities. We have a framework for introducing infill into communities, and it's been okay in some aspects, and it's been a gong show in others. And so what the city has tried to do is to constantly upgrade its infill policies and regulations to keep up to the practice on the ground, because you can't anticipate everything. So they did. They created the third package. And you'll see at the very end, the parrots went from 100 to 700 to now 2,000. I think it might even be around 2,800. So the metaphor here is there's different kinds of, there's different insights to be gleaned from this story that I think are universal to community change in general. If we'll go to the next slide. And that is, in order to get impact, some kind of impact, in this case, a parrot, we actually need outcomes at multiple levels. Now, this is us artificially creating this phrase. All change makers like you have to command the framing of what a result is. You have to do it. No one else would do it. If you don't do it, they're going to do it. If you don't do it, they're going to ask for some kind of number, for a proxy for messy reality. We have to frame this for people. And so one way of framing it is to say, we all want some kind of impact, but in order to get that, we have to make changes at landscape, culture, systems, and policies and niche innovations. We are more likely to get impact if over time, if we don't pretend there's a silver bullet intervention, but we orchestrate these activities over time. It's mostly long-term. So I don't know Lars that well. Probably know a little bit about it, but that's long-term work, right? That's not a program happening overnight. You got to get that into the cultural DNA of a community. You got to build innovations. There's possibly policy implications. I don't know if there would be at a local level, but there might be. It's maybe around housing and units and multi-family dwellings, etc. So it's the accumulation of these little outcomes over time that build impact. And I actually can't see the bottom of my screen here. Oh, no, I can. And that tracking and communicating results, rather than saying, show me some kind of magic metric that will please everyone, we have to develop our own narrative. A narrative plus parrots equals parrotive. So again, it's a crappy joke, but just pretend you think it's funny. And what we're trying to do in this thing is every one of you's got a version of a parrotive. And it's not parrots. It might be, Lars has got a certain kind of sense of impact of things it wants to see. It might be community safety. It might be retrofitting neighborhoods for energy transition, etc. So narratives help people understand impact, not metrics. Metrics are simply dumbed down stories. Think about that. That's a big phrase, right? Dumbed down story. Every number's got a story behind it, and we don't understand it unless there's a narrative and a context to it. So next slide. What we're doing here is, in order to add something to your work, we're adding a fifth outcome: strengthening capacity and community connections, right? Relationships, resident engagement, resident connections. And we're not going to talk about that today, even though, Glenda, we almost defaulted into doing that because that's a form of impact, but we're going to call it an outcome for the moment. You might want to call it an impact and we can later, but we want to distinguish the engaging of residents and the improving of their social connections, relationships, and trust. That is an outcome, but often it's will lead directly or indirectly to some kind of impact, a imperative, saving parents, or something else. Go to one more slide. And so this was your homework, and Heather, you mentioned a version of it. What is your imperative? What is your hope for mission impact? What kind of outcomes do you want to track and communicate? Do you do now? And what kind of outcomes would you like to track and communicate in the future? Because at the end of this module, series of modules, we would like to see if we can, each of you can tell a couple of imperative stories to get good at communicating your results. Next slide. So, actually, why don't we do this? Glenn, I think we chatted about this. Let's use the chat room function. Everyone just crank out really quickly in a couple of words. What is your domain of impact, your imperative story? Safety, children, parents, etc. Just crank it into the chat box and let's just see what you come up with. What is the impact you want to, you're doing neighborhood-based deepening community work in order to see what? Okay, so Angie, that's an end, that's a means to an end and an end in itself, building connectivity. Angie, why is that important? Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. You'd think I would be really good at this, all the Zoom meetings I've been doing. That's actually one of the values in our city social master plan. There's 5 values that people said were important, and one is creating a sense of community and connectedness. So it's kind of marching papers.
Yeah. And Angie, just as we know, you and I don't think we've chatted about this, but I think anyone who's read Robert Putnam's work knows that if you have stronger connections and trustful relationships, almost all the other quality of life indicators go up. Yes. Right? Mental health, job connection, etc. Almost everything goes up. It's the biggest driver of well-being that we have, actually, at least as far as research tells us. So it's an outcome that generates other impacts that generates other impacts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Senior,
I just be better at telling that story.
We have to get better. Yeah, absolutely. Wait, look at this, Glenda. It's about connectivity and belonging. I think we're going to impress people with some real-time adjustments here right away in this presentation because we're going to come back to this. Okay, everyone, awesome. Thank you. This was really good. Glenda, Heather, any reflections on this?
I'm not surprised. That's what I want to say. I'm not surprised, but I was wondering if some were looking at community safety or emergency preparedness, especially in light of what's going on now. This is, yeah.
I have a question. So as I'm reading through here, is this like detailed enough, or is this meant to be high level?
I like it as a domain, Heather, like just the general ballpark of what people are thinking about. And what's surprising to me, I think to your point, Glenda, I had assumed, I think wrongly, that people were interested in privileging community connectedness, but they saw it as well as a means to an end to something else, right? Let's rally community connectivity and relationships in order to improve safety or emergency preparedness. But this is a pretty powerful signal, 6 out of 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. There's that enhanced, yeah, interesting.
Well, Glenda, you had said as much as well. So we're going to adapt in real time here. We'll I'll surprise both you and Heather here shortly. So let's go to the next slide then. So we know that the imperative is connectedness and engagement. We're going to talk about different types of impact. Now, this I still think this works. So let's go to the next slide. I find this, folks, I do these webinars as much to try and be coherent about my own learnings and thinking as anything else. So normally I'm supposed to be this expert telling people how to do stuff, but I'm just a schmuck trying to make sense of it as much as you do. And I think the only difference is I have to do this full time, almost. So It's like that school, anyone taught education, sometimes you're 2 weeks ahead of the kids in the curriculum, right? I got to teach that math module, but I got to read about it and get ahead of them by 2 weeks. So it's roughly like that. But I think this is hard won insight. When people talk about impact, I think there's different types. I'm going to show you a diagram right away. And I think this is really important if someone says, tell me the impact of your work. Yeah, and the diagram is good. We'll keep it to the diagram. Programmatic impact is you may have a specific intervention, a block party, right? A particular program, a service you offer. And in terms of your imperative, engagement, connectivity, emergency preparedness, you get programmatic effects from that. Does that make sense? That's relatively direct. Targeted impact is, let's say you were working in a neighborhood for a while, a very specific neighborhood or even a block, and you had multiple interventions going on at the same time, but it wasn't the entire community, but it was, let's say, a school. That would be targeted impact. So, some of you who've done poverty reduction work, it's really hard to show population level change on poverty when you do community-based work, but you might say, hey, look at neighborhood A, or look at, we're trying to improve high school graduation rates, and we can't do the whole school system, but these 3 schools where we have intense effort, multiple wraparound services and supports, et cetera, we see an accumulation of efforts for part of the community. Community-wide effort this is swinging for the fence, and everyone talks about language like moving the needle. This really is that space. This is where cumulative interventions are meant to actually have an impact at community-wide, right? So we move the needle on high school graduation rate, or our volunteerism rate went up all across the city. Or we did a social capital study and all people from Saskatoon are now feeling more connected. So I'm just going to stop there, or maybe we've got one more slide that we can refer to. So when we talk about the St. Lucian story, for example, they actually have multiple kinds of impacts. They might have very specific programmatic impacts from a preservation program, right? Stopping people from poaching birds in a certain part of the island. They had a little program. That might be one impact. But mostly, when you talk about the 100 to 2,000, this has been about community-wide impact. Their stories about community-wide, but if you dug into that story, you'd have a bunch of targeted and programmatic stories as well. So I'm just going to open this up again, and then maybe we could use the chat room and then react to it again. When you think about your work, what level or levels of impact would you like to describe and track? And you might say all 3, or you might say primarily targeted or primarily programmatic. Jump into the chat room again. Which one of these, all 3 of these bubbles, one more than the other, or only one of them? Jump in and let's see what you got to say. Angie's all 3. Emily's programs plus targeted, yep. Scale might be a big issue there. Emily's community-wide impact is very hard when you got big scale communities. Carlos at all 3. Tanya, programmatic and targeted. Target and programmatic. Deborah, community-wide, okay. I think that's 1, 2, 3. I think that's everything. Okay, guys, good. Well, now let's just open it up. Do you see why this might make a little bit of a difference? Because it sure does around indicators and methods. Tracking community-wide impact is a different circus altogether than tracking the impact of a program. Yeah. Heather, do you want to weigh in, and Glenda, and then we'll open it up? Does this help us think a little bit about the kinds of imperatives we might tell?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Glenda. Yeah.
it is really interesting because for some, like, okay, let's talk about what our programmatic impact is, like that. Let's really focus on how are we measuring the impact of our block parties or our block party program, right?
Yeah.
Versus how are we doing the overall sense of community belonging. And so it will be interesting to see how, to me, yeah, if our imperative shifts when we start thinking about how wide we want to go.
And I'm wondering, in terms of, Laverne just added in that community-wide to start, targeted and programmatic later.
Yeah.
So it's funny that Laverne, thanks for putting that in there, because I was thinking the same thing. Can I start with one? And then as I'm doing this, go, wait a second, I'm going to narrow down.
Interesting. Heather, I'm glad you picked up on that, because Laverne, usually, and by usually doesn't mean right, it just means usually, people often say, let's start with programmatic. And the reason they do that is to say, we are in the game of making a big impact over time, but we can't demonstrate that to you yet. But here's a programmatic intervention and the kind of outcomes it generates. And so it looks and feels like this, right? It's like watching a cooking show. You know, where someone makes a big meal, but they don't have it ready in time, but they yank something out of the fridge or the oven and they go, it kind of looks like this when it's done. Many people start there and saying, this is an exemplar of what we would like to do at scale. So I really like that you, yes, to your point, Heather, you can start with one and go into the others, but usually it's the other way around. So I really like the challenge of this.
Yeah. And then my other thing is, does your capacity also fit in with, because community-wide to me seems like it's a big, like it would take a lot to do, or am I wrong on that?
It might. We'll touch upon that in the third point about different models, but community-wide in general is more effort, but it may not be if you're already going to use indicators that exist and data that is gathered.
Okay.
Let's open it up to others. Any reflections on any of this?
It's Deborah. I'm wondering if I could say a little something just to get maybe more ideas from the group. We have done a new sense of community survey this year. So we were using the original one that was developed by a researcher in the States, but we hired our own folks to look at like the drivers of sense of community, so we would know what interventions we could take. So we have that community-wide measure for every ward.
Yep.
So that's interesting. I think the overall average sense of community in Edmonton is 70. What does that really mean? I don't know. But so we have that kind of measure, but at the same time, we're measuring what our program is doing and who's involved in connecting at the block level.
Yep.
So would that be us doing programmatic and community-wide, Mark, do you think?
It really is. You're working at multiple scales. You got a community-wide thing, which, by the way, often in big change efforts for a while is simply monitoring it, because you might say, Deb, I'm going to play a game. Like you and the team and Howard and others saying, listen, we're monitoring sense of community across Edmonton, but we can't influence that yet. But we are going to show you how we're influencing intervention level, programmatic level, and maybe even targeted. Like, look what's happening in Norwood. We got a bunch of stuff going on in Norwood, and here's the advantage of that. And look at the block party in Parkview, and look at, see how that's doing. So you are operating at multiple levels there for sure. It's a great example. It'd be nice to see that survey. It's called Sense of Community, Deborah.
Yeah, they developed new tools because they said that the one that we were previously using didn't demonstrate the drivers, what's driving the sense of community. So how can we impact it? So now we did a bunch of focus groups so we could determine the drivers of that. And it's pretty interesting work. It'll be out in the city plan. I'm not sure exactly when, but once we can share it, I can share it with everyone.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
And I'll put the link, because the sense of community index that you were referring to, Deborah, I'll put the link on so people can see.
And just something to note that there's this new there's a sense of community index developed by a researcher. I can't remember his name, but he also has a short one that's like 12 questions. So if anyone's, because the other one's like 34 questions, which a lot of people won't answer, I could share the 12 question one if people have it.
It's great. Thank you, Deborah. Any others, folks? Just reactions to this?
Emily at Greenwich Chaplain in Cambridge, Ontario. I work with other executive directors from the other 7 neighborhood organizations across the city. So we have funding from the municipality, but we operate as individual nonprofits. Some of us have charitable status, some of us don't. So I'm really interested in learning all these pieces, taking my learning from this year and hopefully, sharing that to the network in 2021.
Great, thanks, Emily. And is Bill Davidson still around?
Yes, yeah.
Say hi. I was there 25 years ago in Cambridge.
Okay.
I worked on
will.
35 Dixon.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks, Emily. So, but by the way, again, all we're doing here is trying to be clear about the it that we're talking about. So we're talking about impact being connectivity, engagement, possibly with spin-off outcomes, and that impact can be chunked into these archetypical programmatic, targeted, and community-wide impact. So,
Yeah.
Angie, you were jumping in too, I think.
Well, I was just going to say that I have been doing evaluation for quite a long time, but probably just asking the questions and not actually doing anything with the information. So since 2011, we've been evaluating our block parties, so the program level. And then 2 years ago, we started evaluating Little Free Libraries and also Neighborhood Connectors initiative. So, and then now we're sort of adding that all together. And I do want to figure out how to do to the community-wide, because it is my goal to create that sense of community and connectedness for everyone. But how do you measure that? And I just want to also share, I really appreciated doing this homework, and I did do it yesterday. So, you know, just so you know. But I think it was good because it's been, this last few months have been difficult, and it was a good opportunity to reflect on where I've been. And I think I felt really bad at the beginning of all this because I couldn't really do a lot to support the neighborhoods with the EOC up. But people just jumped in and did so much stuff to help each other that I feel like, and I don't have any way of proving this, but maybe through this work, I have had some success in creating a culture of care that people would do that. And I don't know how to measure that. And I imagine you're all seeing that in your neighborhoods too, but it was really interesting to reflect on that. And somehow it'd be cool to measure that.
I love it. Angie, I'm going to just ask you to remind me when it feels right. I might forget it as we proceed because I'm going to make some adjustments here. That is a good candidate from possibly for a methodology called outcome harvesting.
Ooh, sounds
okay.
Cool.
So like keep that in your head. So if we get to a point and you think, where the hell is that? Why are we talking about it again? Remind me, but I'm going to try and remember it. But that's a great case study. Retrospective evaluation. I want to tell you why I love that methodology.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Great. Any others? Or do we want to move to the next point? Okay, we're going to go to the next point. Now, here's the third thing, everyone. This is a bit clearer to me now than it was yesterday when we talked about what are the right indicators and methods. And I came into this thinking, you know, unlike poverty reduction, which is still pretty hairy, like there's so many different ways to measure with different methods poverty reduction. I thought, what is something we could say universally about anyone in a community wanting to measure the impact of their community building work? And really, when I sit down and do design, there's only 3 different ways to do it. And none of them are perfect. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Number 1 is you say, hey, there is a set of indicators and a method with it, and it already exists, and it's been tried and developed and used before. So Deborah, you talked about the sense of community index, right? You'd say, let's use it. So what's the great thing about that? Well, it's probably been tested, it's already been developed, and you may not need deep expertise because it might be well articulated, right? What's the downside of that? You might say, well, that's credible and tested and it's laid out like a recipe, but that doesn't really capture what we want to capture. Why? Because everyone's in a different community. Everyone's got slightly different things. So Deborah, when you did it, when you used the sense of community, did you adopt it fully or did you adapt it a bit? And you're on
we adapted it. We just determined that it wasn't measuring the things we knew we could actually influence. So we adapted it.
Well, and so I think option 2 is the more common option. You look at what someone else has done and you go, I get it. I like the structure. I can see how long it's going to be. And then you adapt it to your context and need. You shorten the number of questions. You change some nouns. You'd say, I got to do this online. And so that it's relatively faster and easier to do, but you then lose possibly some of the validity if this instrument's been tested in other places. I think this is a sweet spot, everyone. I love looking at other methods and going, I get it, I will adapt it. I always hope there's a technique out there where we can adopt it, but I'm mostly disappointed. It's just almost impossible to find something that hits your sweet spot. Now, the third option is to say, here's the impact we want. I've checked stuff out. There's really nothing to adopt or adapt. I have to build something. I got to build it from scratch. Now, the upside of that is if you do it, it's most likely to capture your unique impact, correct? You'd say, yeah, we got something customized to our work. The downside is pretty obvious. It's a pain in the butt. It takes time to develop. You may develop it and there might be holes in it. You may not have enough expertise to do it well, right? It may take a long time. And these are all trade-offs, everybody. But these really are the options. When you want to measure community engagement and connection, what are the models out there? Any of them to adopt, any of them to adapt, or are they so missing the mark that we got to create something from scratch? Now, let's go to the next slide, Glenda. So I've got lots of examples that are you know, unevenly neighborhood focused, but some of them are. Calgary's homeless management information system for their 10-year plan to end homelessness is pretty excellent, but it costs untold millions of dollars to develop. But it's really customized, right? Other groups have said, I don't want to do that. I want to adapt an existing system. So they use something called efforts to outcomes. And it's got lots of problems, but they adapt it. So there's examples of building. There is Adopt. The Parkdale neighborhood, I believe this is in Toronto, has their own kind of framework here. Let me just move this. Neighborhood Indicators in Parkdale. And I look at that and I think right away, yeah, I kind of like that. It's kind of coherent. I don't know if I could do it exactly that way, but let's do the Parkdale thing and add some different features to it. Let's go to the next slide. Adopt, I'm going to give you another example of Adoptin. Worked with an Indigenous organization on the prairies, and they wanted to measure the resiliency of kids who are participating in a program to prevent them from joining gangs, Indigenous kids, really at-risk kids. So there was a resiliency tool, and there's a bunch of them out there. We were looking at one from Calgary, and it looked pretty good. But they said, this doesn't really capture what we want, including, check this out, they were also going to rural communities. And one of the questions in the survey, and this was validated nationally, everybody, was to what extent do you participate in recreation services at your rec facilities? Okay, makes sense? Pretty good kind of sense of connectivity. They said, you know what our rec facility is? It's a portable trailer with mold in it. We can't even go inside. Like real, right? So you kind of go, that might be valid and tested. It's not valid for my neighborhood though, right? So they had to adapt it. So they took the resiliency framework and they put it in a medicine wheel framework, and it was inspired and informed by the tool, but they had to adopt it. Now, more likely than not, everyone, when it comes to developing your own indicators and methods, you are probably going to use a mix of all three. And I'm going to end this with this section before we go into discussion with a funny little story. One of the best evaluators in Canada, his name is Andy Rowe. He used to be the head of the Canadian Evaluation Society. Told a story once about tracking impact of the moratorium on the cod fishery in Newfoundland, which many of you are familiar with. And they used a lot of existing data from Canada Fisheries, right? They tracked the heck out of that stuff. So you have research scientists coming out with big bar graphs. You can find it all on the Government of Canada website, but it didn't provide really good localized data. So they had to come up with their own method. Now, rather than develop something really expensive, here's the method they came up with. Guess who they asked? They asked cod fishery people. They said, how do we track the stock in a way that's easy and feasible? So Angie, you had mentioned something about that earlier, like feasibility. And here's what the cod fishermen came up with. Emily, there's a lot of people from Newfoundland and Cambridge, if I remember correctly. He said they do something called catch and release. Catch and release is the amount of time it takes before you get your limit of fish for personal consumption, right? So you're going fishing. Now, if the fishery is really hot, you might get your catch and release quota within 10 minutes. I don't know these numbers, I'm making them up. If the stock is down, it might take you 9 hours to get your personal limit before you whatever. So when they come into the harbor, and they said, we come into the harbor anyways and we report this, all we do is put in the book, what's my catch and release time? And that was a proxy indicator for them that was meaningful for them. It wasn't imposed from the outside, it was meaningful for them. So I'm actually going to give you one more example of that, the power of proxy indicators. This is a crazy, oh, we don't actually have that much time. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, let's go to the next slide, Glenda. So when it comes to the deepening community stuff, here's where I think we have to do a mea culpa. I thought we were going to focus a lot more on crazy different kinds of impact. I want emergency preparedness. I want to see Emily and Lang's Farm, for example, they're always preoccupied with children's services, early learning and care and all that kind of stuff. I thought those are going to be the impact zone, but most of you have actually come up with questions about connectedness and relationships in your community. So I think we actually have a standard size of impact. And I'd like to propose to you that we will, in our workbook, with that information, create a table which summarizes the following kinds of ways to track, indicators and tools to track impact. So I'm going to ask you to take a piece of paper and a pen right now, everyone, just so you can jot this down. It will be a 4x4 table. And working from left to right on the columns, level 1 will be level of impact. Column 2 will be programmatic impact. Column 3 will be targeted impact. And column 4 will be community-wide impact. Row number 2 will be level 1 effort. I don't have a lot of time and energy or capacity. Level 2 effort, some version of I got some time, energy, and capacity to actually do this. And level 3 effort is I've got time and capacity, and this is a high stakes tracking of impact. I have to nail this. Angie, I'm just you're popping up here. You got to go to council, St. Albert Council, to say something, and you need really good data. So you might say, I need level 3 results on targeted impact. So, and the idea would be that the table would be, what are our options for adopting or adapting existing models in those 3 quadrants? So what's an easy to use option for level 2 targeted, right? And if you agree that the level of it, that the impact is largely engagement and connectivity, we could start with that as round 1. But as we did this, Glenda and Heather, a little bit further on, if some of you then start to surface, okay, I feel good about that, but now I'm kind of interested in the second iteration of this, early learning and care, emergency preparedness, we could try and mimic that for other domain impacts. But we begin with connectivity and relationships. So that's a proposal. That's the surprise out of the blue. Because we were going to spend, Glenda, if I'm not telling tales out of school, we were going to say, tell us what you want to work on, and we'll go find that. But I think we've just been told 20 minutes ago that people want connectivity and relationships. Let's open it up. First, Glenda, I'm going to ask you to speak first because I just turned something upside down on you without asking because we got this interesting feedback 20 minutes ago.
Well, what we said was this is about co-design and co-developing and co-generating. And so this is what it looks like in action, right? So I'm actually pretty excited that we got some very clear indicators. And I'm actually so pleased that we're all kind of on the same page so we can go through this together and learn together. Because I think once we do this once, then as we go, if people start to change or say, hey, we also want to look at this indicator, then we will have gone through a process together that everybody can then reflect on and use again. So this is what we said would happen, just differently. That's all. I'm pretty excited for it.
Great, Glenda. Thanks. Heather, did you want to weigh in? We didn't really, and then we'll open it up. We didn't really involve you in our design here, but are you okay with this direction?
I love it. I love it because I think that if we were all in different directions, it would be really hard to support. So selfishly, thank you all for coming together and agreeing on kind of one indicator because it makes our lives easier.
Great, thanks, Heather. Well, let's open it up. People, the reaction again is round one. We create a table of existing options for you to adopt and adapt, knowing that when you look at it, you might say, I got to build something. What out there isn't good enough for me and I have to build it. But at least you'll know, you'll have done your we'll do some due diligence for you around what your options are and create quite a repository, I think, of techniques if I anticipate this going the way I think it might. Anyone want to, let's just see a show of hands. Who feels this is excellent? Let's go.
Yes.
Okay. Who feels I wanted something different at this point, at least around impact, knowing we're going to get to the outcome stuff as well? Can't really tell. Who feels somewhere in between? Okay, well, hey, I think it's good. Well, let me also then say, Angie, just to confirm that I haven't forgot, outcome harvesting will be one of those methodologies that we'll describe, not this time, but another time. And I also want to leave you with the following idea, given that we landed so cleanly on engagement and connectivity. There is when we're doing evaluation, and many of you have done it before know this, we'll talk about contribution right away. Sometimes we don't, using existing data as data and evidence is legitimate. So we don't always have to reprove things. So for example, if we know that kids who graduate, who go to school hungry have a hard time participating in learning activities and therefore they don't graduate, we don't have to keep, when we do a breakfast program, we don't have to say, look, our breakfast program improved graduation rates. That's a ridiculous use of energy. The data already exists that kids who are hungry don't do well at school. So our challenge will be, can we show you that our program improved, just got rid of hunger? Not got rid of hunger, but made sure that that was an impediment at schools. And we already know the downstream benefits are proven. This is really important in social capital because I believe of all the stuff that I've done in 25 years, the evidence on the value of social capital is the strongest evidence base we have. We should not keep reproving it. So when you're going to councils, etc., one of our level 1 or level 2 interventions might be, the case is already proven. Let me just show you that we did connectivity work and this many people are involved and this is how well it worked. And I might give you an anecdote or two, but I'm not reproving the evidence base. It's already shown, right? So there's something there about we're not always going to have to reprove and gather new data to make impact points. There's an awful lot to be said about drawing on existing evidence if you frame it and communicate it well. It saves a lot of effort. Okay, folks, that's good. Let's go to the last point. You remember this diagram from last time, everybody? When people say, what's the, oh, you've got impact, how do we know that you contributed to it? So Andrew, you got a vexing issue there. You got a tough one. You've got an impact where you've seen communities demonstrate spontaneous patterns of caring, it looks like. And you might say, well, that looks like an example of how we do good work. How do I trace a line of sight to what we may have done before? So that's really contribution analysis more than attribution analysis. And here are the features of it. And I'm not going to go over it again. But Glenda, maybe we'll go to the next slide. We know that we can talk about this at multiple different levels. Folks, can we go 5 minutes over? Do people have to leave? I apologize for this. 5, okay, thank you. Some of you may have to leave. I live in this community called Crestwood in Edmonton, and it's a pretty connected community. A lot of people involved in the community league. The Edmontonians know the community. And our neighborhood right across, we live across from 2 schools and a park. And we had drug dealers who would meet in front of the school, not because they were selling in the neighborhood, but it was a really easy place for people to meet. Everyone knew where this place was. So they lined up across the street. and they would just sell drugs, nothing heavy, no violence or anything, but it was clear what they were doing. So we created a little neighborhood response team spontaneously, and that we didn't even tell the community league until later. We had a little thing where one person would go out. We would phone each other all along down the block, and we'd say, it's your turn. And someone goes out and talks to the drug dealers and says, hey guys, not judging what you're doing. We would be clear to say that, saying, but it's a community neighborhood. People get really anxious. There's lots of kids around here. So do you mind not doing that stuff here? And as they did that, within 2 or 3 minutes, I forgot what it was, someone else would come out of their door and walk on the street. And then a third person would come. And our best day, we had 7 people walk out within 10 minutes. Now, it wasn't being a bully. It was kind of saying, we wanted to make it awkward for people to do it. And we cleared it up like crazy. Like I just thought last night there was something going on. And I haven't had to do it for years. And I went, oh, I got to go start connecting with all these neighbors to reboot this program. But that was a very clear line of sight there. And we might say, we can't be convinced of this, but we're pretty sure we contributed to it. And here's why. And we would make a reasonable judgment. So if we go to the next slide, we can get really sophisticated with this, and we can even ask different stakeholders to observe whether our work contributed to an impact. And there's an example here in Niagara region, and I mentioned this last time, where we had all the players of the creation of a new center judge the relative contribution of each other people's efforts to the outcome, not their own, right? So Emily, you were doing something on you were doing something neighborhood. You wouldn't judge your own. You'd say, here's how Bill helped, and here's how the city helped, and here's how Pat, I don't know if she's still at the food bank there, et cetera. They all help, but you would judge someone else's contribution, and then you've got a more rounded 360-degree intelligence. So if we go to the next slide, Glenda, we have another opportunity here to be leveled about how to do this. If someone asks a contribution question in the same way they ask an impact question, we can have a level 1 response saying, of course, there's probably multiple factors, and here's whether we think we had a big one or a small one. In the case of that drug deal in front of Crestwood, I think we had a big impact, and here's why. We could go level 2, we could ask stakeholders to rate it like they did in Niagara. Or level 3, there's some pretty heavy methodologies to go through this. So again, Angie using that as a proxy, if you had to go to council and they wanted a high burden of proof, you'd say, okay, what's in my level 3 toolkit to go make a bigger claim? Again, a table where we give you options, all you get is options, and you could decide do you adopt, adapt, or do you build from scratch. Okay, so that's that.
Mark, can you explain more about outcome harvesting, like you said you would earlier?
Yeah. Well, what I'll do is it'll be in the workbook, but I'll send you a link to outcome harvesting. What outcome harvesting does, the reason I love it is because it's really good when you want to look retrospectively back at something. There's lots of players and the outcomes emerge over time. You may not even have a plan, a logic model, or theory of change. It doesn't matter. Because it says is outcomes emerge like the narrative story, right? This leads to that leads to this, and it's like retracing a story, and it allows for multiple interventions. It might say, hey, here's the outcome. We had 17 different moments where we contributed to that outcome or that impact. And by the way, here's how we played a role in each of those moments. Sometimes it was big, right? We ran on the street and we connected with these drug dealers. Sometimes it was indirect. Here's what we did in Crestwood. We got the schools to do SEPTED audits, crime prevention through environmental design, right? And all they did, guys, is they put like lights on by the park, right? They go on when someone drives by. It's irritating for my house, by the way, but it helped reduce crime, but it keeps me up at night. But we had big moments, a lot of moments of outcomes, and sometimes where we were big and pushy and indirect, but it allowed us to tell that story over time. And there's a methodology for doing it. I can share that with you. I forgot who asked that question. Was it Deborah? No. No, okay. Oh, so, but that will be part of the methods piece. So let's go one more, Glenda. let's just do a show of hands or in the chat room again. You could put yes, no, or maybe. Who thinks based on what they know that when they produce their first narrative story, which is our goal as trail builders, try and crank out some kind of story just to get good at communicating. Who thinks they might need to employ some version of contribution analysis? Might be level 1, 2, or 3. Yes, no, or maybe are your options. Please vote in the chat room. Glenda, we could have had a survey on this next time.
We told them next time we will. Polls are fun.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
3 out of 6.
4.
4. 5. It might be 7. 6. Awesome.
Awesome.
Good.
Everybody.
Okay, so let's maybe go to the next slide then. We can't take any last questions, but here's what we said today, folks. There's a difference between impact and outcomes to impact, but we settled on the fact that for most of you, the primary impact is connectivity and engagement with spin-off benefits that you might want to track later. Number 2, we're going to create a, we know that there's different types of impact, programmatic, targeted, and community, and that some of you have 1 or 2, some of you have all of them, some of you have a sequence, but it's good to have those codes in your head. We know that we're going to create a table around connectivity and engagement, which talks about all 3 levels of impact and 3 levels of effort, and give you options from which you can adopt or adapt or decide, damn it, there's nothing there for me. I have to build the stupid thing. You're going to have to do that on your own. And then we're going to mirror that with a similar table on contribution analysis. Yeah. Boy, that's a pretty good hour. Glenn, I'm going to turn it over to you for just see if there's any last questions or discussions, or if you want to jump right into homework.
I feel like I know Laverne even had a question, but if we want to send questions, just send us your questions, and then I'll work with Mark, or send me your questions. I'll work with Mark. We'll come up with the frequently asked questions and get that information back out to you, just to respect everyone's time. But just like last time, there's homework. And this time it's interesting because we kind of already addressed one of the things that was going to be your homework. So lucky you. So what we want you to do with your manager of cities with me, I'm going to be the one who's going to reach out and like be tapping you on the shoulder around your homework, just so you know. So don't ignore my emails. So let's talk about the results of the last module, kind of what you gained from there, what you're thinking. We'll review all of that. And then we're going to talk, we did this, we identified what are the indicators and methods you'd like to see in the workbook, but we will kind of start talking about that chart that Mark had us draw up. And so I want to learn just a little bit more from you about what you're looking for and dive a little bit deeper. I know, Deborah, you had indicated that you wanted something just a little bit different. And so we'll chat about that too. And then let's talk about what are 1 to 5 narratives that you want to tell? What are the impact? What are your imperatives, if you will? Let's get clear and clean on those, so that then when we come back to our next round, we will be good to go. Does that make sense? We will send this all out. We will get a workbook. It won't be quite as quickly because we are developing on the fly. And so it will take us a little bit of time to get that generated for you, so it makes sense based on our conversation today. But you will get that shortly too. So you've got a little bit of homework free time. That's what I want to say.